Hello everyone, it's Tuesday and you're watching Within the Frame. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. Israel and Hamas have agreed to extend the 4-day truce in Gaza by 2 additional days. The extension, mediated by Qatar, went into effect when hostages were released on Monday. Though the truce has been extended for now, Israel is firm in its stance that Tel Aviv's military will fight with a stronger force when the truce is over. Meanwhile, a U.S. top diplomat is expected to travel to Israel to discuss sustaining the increased flow of humanitarian aid into the enclave and what the future of the Gaza Strip will be. For this, we invite Professor Anoush Ehteshami from Durham University. Welcome, Professor Ehteshami.
Good evening. Thank you very much for having me.
Good evening. Thank you for joining the show. And we also have Professor Mehran Kamrava from Georgetown University Qatar. Good to see you, Professor.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Thank you for joining the show. Now, first question to our Professor Ehteshami. Israel and Hamas agreed on a temporary pause after 7 weeks of hostilities and have even extended the ceasefire by 2 days. And the Wall Street Journal pointed out that Hamas agreed in order to ensure its survival. Do you agree?
I think there is a grain of truth in that, because the onslaught by Israel was very intensive, and obviously Hamas was on the defensive for much of that period, and you could see that in terms of their inability to fire rockets back into Israel as a response to Israel's attack. That said, though, I think it's a lot harder to dismantle the infrastructure of Hamas than was previously thought. The assumption is, the calculation right now is that between 1,000 and 2,000 Palestinian fighters may have been killed in this battle. But we also think that there are between 10 and 20,000 Hamas fighters. So it's a drop ocean. So it's not the defeat of Hamas in the ways that was projected at the beginning of this conflict, but rather a gradual diminution of the military power.
Right, I see. Well, I'd like to also ask about why Israel agreed to, come up with the ceasefire. As we all know, Israeli Prime Minister was quite firm about Israel's offensive maneuvers, Professor Kamrava, but eventually it agreed to the ceasefire after long deliberation. Could it be safe to say the international pressure made Israel to agree to the ceasefire?
That's definitely a part of it. I think the ceasefire is the product of a couple of factors. As you mentioned, there's the international pressure, but also the domestic pressure to release hostages and to do something tangible to bring Israeli civilians home. There's also the reputational cost. After all, there is massive killing of Palestinians, civilian Palestinians, as Professor Ehteshami just mentioned, and the numbers that are just absolutely staggering. So I think this level of killing and massacre couldn't be indefinitely sustained without some sort of what the European Union likes to call humanitarian pause.
Right, I see. Yeah. So international domestic pressures and also reputation could have been one of the reasons why Israel agreed to the ceasefire. Now, during the truce up till now, Professor Ehteshami, how many hostages have been released by Hamas so far, and what route did they take?
The only way in and out of Gaza Strip now is the Rafah crossing through Egypt. All other crossings that go across Israel have been closed. So this is like an open-air prison, if you like. And Egypt has to be directly involved in every decision that is negotiated in Doha between Israel, United States, and Hamas about the release of hostages. And so that makes it a very complicated process of negotiations, because there has to be some tangible communication between Hamas and the Israeli government over this process. And the Egyptians have to agree to oversee all this. That's why it's so laborious and time-consuming to release even 10 hostages. But we think that by the end of the current truce, which is extended by 2 days, as you rightly mentioned, we may have about 70, 75, certainly fewer than 100 of the hostages that Hamas and its allies and others have taken from Israel. And on the other side, of course, the hope is that there'll be 150 plus Palestinians released from jail. And not all of of course, the released Palestinians are Hamas prisoners. You already noted, for example, that several of the prisoners who've been released were minors. They were under the age of 18. Some children have been released in the West Bank, in Ramallah. So again, it is a very complex set of negotiations that have to take place to then agree. And there is a delay between the release of hostages and the release of prisoners and vice versa. So all of it has to be choreographed very carefully while you keep the political forces on all sides who remain opposed to this on side as well.
Right. So Egypt had to be at the center of releasing the hostages and then making them go back to their home. I see. Now, Professor Kamrava, releasing hostages was one major task, but another was having humanitarian aid enter northern Gaza, which was reportedly the largest consignment of aid given. How did it go?
Well, it's extremely complicated. The distribution of aid is not easy. The infrastructure has been destroyed. Roads have been dug up. There's death and destruction everywhere. And many Palestinian dead civilians are strewn because they have not been allowed to be buried. And so the distribution of aid itself is extremely difficult. We know, for example, that hospitals, schools, refugee camps, even churches and mosques have been bombed and destroyed. And so getting the aid to Gaza is one thing, but getting it to the people who actually need it is quite another thing. And the task is extremely difficult and arduous.
Right, extremely difficult indeed. But still, it is quite fortunate to hear, major tasks were actually being in place quite successfully. But the ceasefire was actually proven quite rocky at times. And first of all, there was even a brief delay before the second group of hostages was released. Professor Ehteshami, is that right?
That's right, Kim. And again, it goes back to what I was saying earlier in terms of the signals that have to be delivered and received and interpreted by both parties before prisoners and hostages can be exchanged. And that is very complicated. And remember, Doha, where Professor Kamrava is based, is not very near the theater of crisis operation in Gaza. So, they have to coordinate with the Americans. They have to coordinate with the countries whose hostages are being released. French, German, British, American, and so on. All those countries have to be informed of what is going on. The Israeli government has to approve the process, as well as if the Palestinian prisoners are being released in the West Bank, for example, for the Palestinian National Authority to be aware of that as well, to notify the parents. So you can imagine there are so many moving parts in these negotiations that inevitably some part of it will go wrong. But can I also add to what Professor Kamrava's point, which is very important, is one thing is to provide aid, is another to distribute it. So much of the infrastructure, as he rightly noted, has been destroyed, and so many people, 1.5 million people, have been displaced, that it's almost an impossible task to make sure that 100 lorries of aid, that's all which is going in now daily, can actually reach the victims of the conflict.
Then, Professor Ehteshami, I'd like to ask you, would there be any ways to distribute the humanitarian aid quite properly, as you have already mentioned?
I think it's a complex task. Professor Kamrava mentioned, when you look at the images, northern Gaza is now completely flattened. It's as if an earthquake has hit it. We know that most of the people have left, but not everybody. And there are still injured people, ill people, immobile people who need that aid desperately. And remember, because the Israeli military is now occupying so much of northern Gaza, they have to provide permission for the aid which is already in Gaza to reach all of these battle zones further up in the Gaza Strip. So that is impossible. But also, if you've seen the images now, it's raining in Gaza. It was raining yesterday. The flooding of basically, wasteland makes it impossible to get these heavy lorries carrying grain, carrying water, carrying supplies, and so on, to negotiate these wastelands to get to people who need it. So it really is a mammoth task. And that is why I think Gazans desperately need the support of the international community to make sure that the lorries which are lined up outside the Rafah crossing, miles and miles and miles of them, can get in, but also that aid can reach the people that need it. You know, southern Gaza was already full. Now 1.5 million people have moved further south, and that makes Khan Yunis's position, for example, almost impossible to manage.
Right, I see. No wonder why this is indeed an arduous task to do. Now, as Professor Ehteshami already pointed out, there are many parties related in this process, and throughout this whole process, nearby countries were no exception. They were very much related in this thing, and especially Qatar played a pivotal role in maintaining and extending the truce between Israel and Hamas. Professor Kamrava, could you tell us more on this? What was their role?
Well, Qatar has had mediation as one of the central pillars of its foreign policy for a number of years. So that provides the larger context and background within which the negotiations and the hostage release and the release of prisoners have occurred. Also, as we know, of course, Qatar has been housing the political commanders and political leaders of Hamas, and by doing so, it has leverage on them. It can put a lot of pressure on them and say, look, we were the only country that allowed you to come here and have an office, and now it's your turn to release the hostages. Now, with that having been said, the Qataris have set up an operations room here in the Foreign Ministry in Doha to coordinate the efforts. They have people on the ground in Gaza, senior ranking diplomats in Gaza and also in Tel Aviv and in Egypt. And so there's tremendous coordination, as Professor Ehteshami just mentioned, not only between the different agencies here in Qatar and the different components that are at work, but also between the Qataris and the different representatives of the countries countries that are directly or indirectly involved.
I see. So Qatar had its leverage to be directly involved in this issue. I see. Now, Professor Ehteshami, tension was actually in the air as Hezbollah also launched a surface-to-air missile at an Israeli drone less than 24 hours after the truce began, breaking the tenuous ceasefire between the two parties. But what was the reason for Hezbollah's attack?
Oh, gosh, that is a really hard one to answer, Kim, because there are multiple reasons for remember, you know, a decade ago or more, Hezbollah had a so-called 36-day war with Israel. Neither side won. Both sides, in effect, lost. But Hezbollah survived. That was Israel's first war, proper war, with a non-state actor in the region. So Hezbollah draws a significant amount of kudos and legitimacy from its resistance, as he likes to call it, against Israel. And the last time round, there was coordination, there has been coordination, in fact, when Hamas has had these kind of skirmishes with Israel in the past, that Hezbollah gets involved, sometimes on the margins of this, to stretch Israel's military forces and to prevent them concentrating all of their massive firepower on one enemy, namely, in that case, Hamas. This time round, you've noticed that there have been skirmishes between Hezbollah and Israel on that border for a few days of the war, into its second week as well, but has since quietened down a bit. And that is partly because Iran has made it clear that it wants no part in the escalation of the military conflict around Lebanon and Gaza. But also, Hezbollah can only do so much in this campaign. It cannot open another front against Israel, given what Hamas had done on 7th of October, and also given the veracity of Israel's reactions against Hamas, that Hezbollah is in no position to facilitate the unleashing of Israel's military power against Lebanese who are suffering economically, socially, as well themselves. They will not thank Hezbollah for bringing Israel's military upon their country. So what Hezbollah has done is just remind Israel that it is there, that it will continue to probe Israel to keep it on its toes. But given that that was a one-off incident, if you like, the chances of it escalating, in my view, have diminished. And the longer the truce goes on, the less likely that Hezbollah will use military force against Israelis.
Right, I see your point. I mean, our Professor Ehteshami already pointed out that Israel-Lebanon border has been quite calm since that attack on Saturday. But I'd like to ask our Professor Kamrava's opinion as well. Should we be worried about Hezbollah's next move?
Well, as Professor Ehteshami just mentioned, I think the longer the ceasefire holds, the truce holds, the less likely the possibility of an escalation. So Hezbollah's next move really depends on Israel. And so I think Hezbollah, as well as Iran, I should add, have taken a wait-and-see attitude to see what happens next, how Israel will behave after the ceasefire is over, the time period is over, and whether or not they need to divert Israeli attention away from Gaza by engaging in limited skirmishes along Israel's northern border.
Right, I see. So Hezbollah's next move depends on Israel's. I see your point, Professor. Now, shifting gears a little bit here, Professor Ehteshami. During the press conference on Friday, U.S. President Joe Biden claimed that Hamas' operation into Israel was a result of Washington's diplomacy in the region aimed at normalizing ties between Saudi Arabia and Israel. How did you see his claims?
I think President Biden is correct to an extent. So for the benefit of the audience, let's just put Saudi Arabia's role here in a broader context. Saudi Arabia is where the two holiest sites of Islam are, where, you know, over 1 billion Muslims turn to pray on a daily basis. And also, Saudi Arabia is the only country which has put forward a comprehensive, known as the Fahad then Abdullah peace plan, which is based on two-state solution. So bringing Saudi Arabia on board in terms of opening negotiations and diplomatic relations with Israel is a really big deal for the Muslim world in general, but for the Arab world in particular. So that was a concern, not just to Hamas, but to Iran and others who wanted to maintain Israel's regional isolation. Having said that, though, but of course, as you know, Israel has relations now with Bahrain, with the UAE, has good links with Oman, has relations with Jordan, with Egypt, with Morocco, in discussions with Sudan, which is governmentless at the moment. So Israel, you know, the barriers to diplomatic relations with the Arab world have been broken. But the one that matters most in many ways is, of course, Saudi Arabia. And it is true, President Biden's point is important, that one way for the resistance front, if you like, including Hamas, to contain that was to unleash the dogs of war in the way that Hamas did on the 7th of October. And we've seen that almost every Arab country has taken a step back from maintaining normal relations with Israel. There's been talk of boycotting trade, diplomatic relations, but even Bahrain, which continue to have good relations with Israel, has recalled his ambassador from Israel because of the ferocity of Israel's reaction to the atrocities of 7th of October. So to put a distance between Saudi Arabia and Israel is an important strategy, but you have to ask Hamas at what cost, given what Israel has now done to the Gaza Strip and its population.
Right, I see your point. So bringing Saudi Arabia could indeed have been a concern for both Hamas and Iran. I see your point. Now, Professor Kamrava, I'd like to stay on the Biden's remarks. Hours after the first hostages were released, Biden addressed the hostage situation, crediting extensive U.S. diplomacy for the truce. Could U.S. involvement have a positive knock-on effect on Biden, and how might developments affect Biden's politics?
Well, we know that right now, Biden is in political trouble domestically in the U.S. if the election were held today, if the presidential election, polls indicate that Donald Trump would beat Joe Biden handily, despite all the legal difficulties that Donald Trump has. So naturally, the Biden administration is going to do as much as it can to claim credit for what is happening in the Middle East, in the Israeli-Palestinian theater, as well as anywhere else, in order to ensure that its political fortunes increase. But also we need to take into account that the U.S. presidential election is a year from now, and a lot can change between now and then.
Right, I see your point. Now, I'd like to ask many more questions to our experts, but since we are running out of time, I believe this would be our last question. Professor Ehteshami, how do you expect the war to develop? I mean, would the truce continue to be extended?
Oh, gosh. How long have we got? And do you have a crystal ball? I think it was expected that the truce will be extended for a limited period. But the pressures on Israeli government are now enormous. Professor Kamrava alluded to this in terms of domestic pressure on Israel. Netanyahu is not a popular prime minister in Israel. And there will be a reckoning after this war is finished about how on earth did Israel get itself into this situation in the first place. The reforms of the judiciary that Netanyahu's right-wing government was proposing had a very direct impact on governance in Israel. Nightly demonstrations and so on. So there is all of that to account for. Given that Netanyahu knows that the longer the war goes on, the longer he stay in power, I wouldn't put it past him to maintain even a low-level continuation of the conflict. But domestically, the Israelis want the hostages back. They want the people back home. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, they're not all Israelis. Thai, German, French, American, from other places. These people need to be able to go home. And the continuation of the war will limit Israel's ability to negotiate the release of these hostages. Also, Professor Kamrava mentioned Biden is under huge pressure to move this forward. It was one thing for the Americans to sit on their hands when Israel retaliated. It's another to continue not to do anything while Gaza is being destroyed like this. So the Americans, who've got the greatest stake in this diplomatically, cannot walk away from this and let the war continue. But also on the other side, Hamas is under pressure to make sure that the Gazans do not suffer in the way that they have done so far, and that they try and return a modicum of peace and security to the people of Gaza. So they are under pressure to make sure that the war doesn't escalate again in the way that it had at the beginning. But there are tough nuts, if I may call it that, on both sides, who do not want to see truce or peace between the two. And we don't know where they apply the pressure and to what extent. But currently, Qatar, United States, European Union, Egypt, Jordan are all putting the diplomatic chips on the line to make sure that this humanitarian ceasefire continues and turns into a more permanent arrangement that will then ultimately lead to negotiations about a two-state solution. Before I finish, I'm sorry I'm taking too much time, we also ought to note that Union for the Mediterranean, which includes European countries as well as Arab countries, Israel was absent from this meeting in Barcelona, has agreed that the priority should be the establishment of a two-state solution. And that remains a priority. So we need to move on from this to diplomacy to end this carnage once and for all.
All right, I see your point, Professor. Thank you for your advice, and I do hope this moves on to the diplomatic efforts. Now, unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition. Thank you, Professor Ehteshami, for your time and insights, and Professor Kamrava for your time and insights as well. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, that's all for Within the Frame tonight. We'll be back tomorrow with more in-depth stories. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.